We're presenting the first research from a large project that we have initiated at St. Jude to look at the genetic component to the long-term complications of cancer survivorship. That is, we know that cancer survivors, because of the treatment they've received, are at high risk for a number of adverse outcomes. And we've characterized quite well what the therapeutic component is, that is, what therapies are associated with what risks. But we also understand that not everybody develops the adverse outcomes, and we think that genetics is playing the determining role in terms of who may or may not develop a late effect after treatment. We used a new cohort that we've developed and established at St. Jude, which is called the St. Jude Lifetime Cohort. And this cohort represents all long-term survivors of pediatric cancer ever treated at St. Jude since it opened its doors in 1962. So the current cohort has over 4,500 survivors. For the studies we're reporting on today, we did whole genome and whole exome sequencing on the first 3,007 participants in that project. It is challenging to track people down, but what's really remarkable is the commitment that patients that come and have been treated at St. Jude have to the institution. Many of them do keep in contact, and so we've had really remarkable participation in our project, where of the total eligible, 85% participate in the project, and of those that we do actually, that we locate, it's 95% agree to participate. And this is a pretty demanding study to be a part of, because what they have to do is travel back to Memphis, and they actually stay on campus for 3 to 4 days while they undergo a very rigorous battery of clinical evaluations. In this first study, there were two objectives. One is to understand what the proportion of survivors are that actually have a mutation in a gene that we currently know predisposes them to cancer. And then, once we identified what that proportion was, we were interested in whether or not having one of those mutations has an impact on whether or not they develop subsequent cancers, which is a very high risk for childhood cancer survivors in general. And so we had this twofold objective for the first analysis out of all the data that we've generated. And the study found that 11.5% of the survivors actually had a mutation in one or more of these known 156 cancer predisposition genes. If we break it down and look at a subset of 60 genes that are known to be highly penetrant and inherited in an autosomal dominant fashion, there we found 5.7% of the patients had one of these mutations. So very high. Some of the mutations we expected to see because we know that they were associated with their first cancer, but that's for a relatively small proportion of pediatric cancers that have actually a known gene mutation that is involved in the etiology of the original cancer. So in essence, what this is telling us is there is a high proportion. What's interesting is if we took that proportion and the distribution within the different cancers, and we applied it to population rates from the SEER program of the National Cancer Institute. And so with those data, we can project that right now in the United States, there's over 32,000 survivors of childhood cancer that have a mutation in one of these 156 cancer predisposition genes. Well, actually, a very small proportion of these we think can be related to the treatment. Only about 3% are what we refer to as a mosaicism. So the vast majority of these we feel are germline mutations that the individual was born with. They could have inherited, likely they inherited the mutation from a parent, but not always. Some of these can be new mutations that occurred, but we have to find that out. Now that's one of our next steps, is to look at the family, to be able to test parents and other family members to help inform where the origin of the mutations came from. But the vast majority likely are inherited from a parent. So the strong recommendation that we're making right now is that any survivor who develops a subsequent neoplasm should be referred for genetic counseling if, first of all, they developed a second neoplasm and didn't receive prior radiation therapy, or the subgroup of patients who did receive prior radiation therapy, if they developed a breast cancer, thyroid cancer, or a sarcoma that arose within an irradiated field, they also should be immediately referred for genetic counseling to determine family history, to look and determine whether or not they should have formal genetic testing to identify the presence or absence of a genetic mutation. Yes, there are several limitations that impact the overall interpretation. First of all, because of the very nature we're studying survivors, the only people that we had available to study are those that were still living. So anyone who may have died prior to our recruiting them into St. Jude Life from either their primary cancer or from a second cancer, we don't have them available to test. So what we think might happen is if these mutations are associated with risk of death from either of those two causes, then our estimate is an underestimate. It's conservative. The other limitation of our study is that the cohort is still relatively young. The group that we studied has a median age of about 35 years, and they've been followed a mean of almost 30 years from their cancer diagnosis, which is a very long time. But in the overall scheme of things, they're still a relatively young population. So with the additional follow-up that will come over the next 1 or 2 decades, the risk pattern could change as these individuals get older and the effect of the mutations that they have in their genes may come into play in terms of higher rates of cancer. So our conclusions may change as we follow them longer.